She found it again in the back of the old wardrobe, the sweater that still carried the faint scent of rain, and memory, the one her best friend left behind all those years ago. She had told herself she would give it back one day, but 15 winters had passed, and the promise had turned to silence. She held it now between her fingers, feeling the softness worn thin by time, the threads slightly frayed like the years between them. She pressed it against her face, and for a moment she could almost hear her friend's laughter again, that sound that once filled every empty corner of her world. They were 17 when they first wore matching sweaters. Two halves of a single heartbeat, walking home from school in the soft drizzle, sharing stories that had no endings back then. Everything felt endless, the city, the sky, their dreams. She remembers how her friend always walked a little ahead, turning back just enough to make sure she was still there, her smile always waiting like a light in the fog. Last day they saw each other, the world was strangely quiet. It was the kind of quiet that comes before everything changes. Her friend was moving away, only a few towns over, she said, but in that moment it felt like another planet they hugged. At the station, the air smelled of cold iron and coffee, and something that felt like goodbye. Her friend pulled off her sweater and draped it over her shoulders, saying, "You get cold too easily, keep this till I come back." And then she laughed, that soft, half-broken laugh that sounded like the edge of tears. The train doors closed, and she watched her reflection blur against the glass. The sound of wheels on tracks echoing through her chest. She thought it would only be a few months, but the months folded into years like paper boats sinking quietly under the weight of distance. She moved through her 20s with that sweater always nearby, sometimes folded neatly, sometimes just thrown across a chair, sometimes clutched in her sleep when dreams of the past refused to fade. She wore it on the nights she missed her friend too much to breathe, on the days when life felt like a room too empty to echo. She never told anyone about the sweater, not even the people she loved. Later, it was her secret, her time capsule, her only proof that once upon a time someone had known her complete a livery year on her birthday. She would wash it carefully and let it dry under the pale morning sun. She liked to imagine that somewhere her friend could feel that warmth the way she once did when they sat on the old rooftop sipping cheap coffee, watching the clouds shift colors, their voices blending into the hum of the city below. 1 year she tried to find her. She searched old social pages, half remembered addresses, fragments of phone numbers, but the world had changed too much, and maybe so had they, she told herself. It was okay, people drift, people grow apart, but every time she touched the fabric she felt the same ache, like time was both moving and standing still. 15 years is a long time, long enough for the heart to forget some things and hold on to others. She had moved to another city now, smaller, quieter, the kind of place where sunsets feel closer and nights stretch a little longer. One autumn evening she saw a girl in the park wearing the same color sweater, that deep sea green shade that once belonged to her friend. Her heart stumbled. She almost called out the name, but stopped. The girl turned and smiled, and for a second it was as if the world folded back on itself and time broke open, revealing every version of her that had ever waited for someone. She sat on the bench watching the leaves fall, remembering how her friend once said, "People are like seasons, some come back even when you think they're gone." At night, she finally opened the old box under her bed, where the sweater had lived, folded beside letters, photographs, tickets to nowhere. She touched the faded tag inside and saw her friend's handwriting, still faintly visible, a tiny doodle of a heart, the ink barely there. She whispered thank you into the quiet room, not because she was ready to let go, but because she finally understood that keeping something doesn't always mean holding on. Sometimes it means remembering softly. She wrapped the sweater around her shoulders and stepped outside. The air was cool and smelled of rain. She looked up at the sky and thought of how they once promised to see the northern lights together, maybe somewhere. Her friend had kept that promise too. As she walked down the street, the wind lifted the edges of the sweater, and she felt lighter. Somehow, like all the years that had weighed her down were beginning to float. She thought of the girl she used to be, the one who waited at train stations and wrote unsent letters and cried into the sleeves of someone else's sweater. She smiled through the ache, because even pain can be beautiful when it carries love. She thought of how memories are not chains, but echoes. They don't bind, they remind. Later that night, she sat by the window and began to talk softly, as if her friend were sitting across from her. She told her about the years that had come and gone, about the people she had loved and lost, the things she had built and broken, the way she had learned that growing up is Not about leaving behind, but about carrying gently. She talked until the room felt warmer, as if the air itself was listening. She closed her eyes and saw her friend. Again, standing in the rain, laughing, hair sticking to her cheeks, the sweater clinging to her like a second skin. She could almost feel the droplets on her own hands. Next morning, she packed the sweater carefully into a small box, tied it with a white ribbon, and wrote a note, just a few words: "Thank you for teaching me how to stay even when you had to go." She left it at the doorstep of the old house where they once lived side by side. She didn't know who lived there now, maybe no one. Maybe someone who would find it and wonder about the story behind it, but she knew she had done what her heart had been waiting for all along, not to forget, not to return, but to release. As she walked away, the morning light caught her face and she felt the quiet joy of something complete. The years of holding on had turned into peace, the ache had softened into gratitude. The memory had become a song without sorrow. She knew she would still think of her friend sometimes when the rain came, or when she saw that color in a store window, or when laughter sounded like it belonged to someone she used to know, but it wouldn't hurt the same way anymore. It would simply remind her that love, even when it fades in distance, never truly disappears. It just changes shape. It becomes part of the air we breathe, part of the sky we look up to, part of the silence we finally learned to live with. And maybe somewhere her friend still had something of hers. Maybe a letter or a photo or a memory tucked away in a forgotten drawer. Maybe sometimes she found it and smiled the way she did now, across the years, across everything that was lost and everything that remained. Two girls who once shared a sweater, now sharing the quiet space between remembering and letting go. She stood there for a while before heading home. The street was still empty, the air tasted of new beginnings. She took a deep breath and whispered goodbye. Not like an ending, but like a promise to keep living fully, to love deeply, to remember softly. And in that gentle moment, she realized that the girl who had kept her best friend's sweater for 15 years had not been waiting at all. She had been healing. She had been learning how to turn grief into tenderness and memory into light. She smiled one last time and walked on her shadow, stretching long behind her like a thread of time that still shimmered with all the colors of what once was and what will always be. Days turned into months, and the memory of the sweater lingered like a scent that would not fade, not heavy, not haunting, just soft, like the hum of something that once mattered deeply. She had learned to live in quieter ways. Now mornings were slower, the light through the window gentler. She found herself watering plants that never bloomed but still kept growing. She thought there was something beautiful in that. In the way life continued, even when it had no reason to. She would sit by the window and watch the rain trace paths down the glass, each drop a tiny reflection of time she had once wished away. On evening, she received a letter in unfamiliar handwriting pressed against yellowed paper. No return address, only her name written the way her friend used to write it, half cursive, half rushed. Her breath caught as she unfolded the page. Inside were just a few lines. It said, "I saw your note. I don't know how to thank you. I kept mine too. 15 years is a long time, but some things never stop finding their way home." She stared at the words until they blurred into tears. She did not know if it was truly her friend who had found the box, or someone else who had understood, but in that moment it did not matter. What mattered was that the world had whispered back. She walked outside that night. The air was cool and full of distant sounds, a dog barking, the soft rhythm of wind through trees. She closed her eyes and listened to the way the earth breathed. She felt a strange warmth inside her chest, like a heartbeat answering another heartbeat across a great distance. She thought maybe love was like that, not always seen, not always spoken, but still alive, moving quietly through time, waiting for us to notice. That following week, she began to write again, small fragments of thought, scattered words that felt like pieces of her she had lost. She wrote about rain and light and laughter. She wrote about the weight of silence and how sometimes it feels like being held. She filled pages without knowing if they would ever be read, but it felt good to let the words fall out like petals from something once in bloom. She started leaving those notes in random places. Bus stops, cafes, libraries, never signing them, just letting them go. Maybe someone would find them. Maybe not, but she liked the thought that her memories could become someone else's comfort. One day, she went back to the city where she grew up. It looked smaller somehow, the streets quieter. The old station still standing, though the paint was peeling. She sat on the same bench where she had last seen her friend. The air still carried that faint scent of iron and rain. She closed her eyes and could almost hear the sound of trains leaving the platform. She whispered into the air, "I kept it for 15 years, but you stayed much longer inside me's." She sat there. She noticed a young girl nearby holding a sweater that looked almost identical, the same deep sea green color, the same worn texture. The girl was laughing with someone, her voice bright like morning. It made her smile. How time circles back, how life repeats itself in softer ways. The girl turned, and for a fleeting second, she thought she saw her friend's eyes in that face, not because they were the same, but because they carried that same warmth, the same spark of unspoken understanding. She realized then that we never truly lose people, we just carry them forward through others. Through ourselves. As sun began to set, painting the sky in colors too tender to name, she stood and began to walk home, her steps light, her heart steady. She thought of all the things she once waited for and how waiting had turned into living. She thought of how sometimes healing does not look like forgetting, but like remembering without pain. She thought of the sweater and the years it had held her together, and she smiled. Because now she could hold herself seasons past. The girl who once kept her best friend's sweater learned to keep moments instead. She collected sunsets and shared laughter and the sound of her own quiet joy. She found friendship again, not the same, but real in its own way. She learned that the heart has endless rooms, each one waiting to be opened. Not replaced, but filled. She grew older, her hair turning the color of dusted silver, her eyes softer, her voice slower. But whenever she looked in the mirror, she still saw that 17-year-old girl standing in the rain, wearing a borrowed sweater with love too big for her chest. In her last birthday she went to the sea alone. She stood where the water met the sand and felt the cold waves kiss her feet. She whispered thank you to the horizon, to the years, to her friend, to herself. And as she turned to leave, she saw something tangled in the wet sand, a piece of green fabric, worn and faded. She picked it up and smiled because she knew it could not be the same sweater, and yet it felt like a sign, like a soft reminder that some connections are too deep to be lost. Pressed it to her heart and laughed quietly, tears mixing with the sea breeze. She thought how strange and beautiful it is that we keep finding what we need exactly when we stop searching. She walked away from the shore with that small piece of green in her hand, and a piece she had never known before. And somewhere far away in another town, a woman opened an old box, found a small note tied in white ribbon, and whispered, "I remember." She smiled too and looked out the window as the rain began to fall, soft and endless and kind, like the past coming home. And in that moment, across years and distance, two hearts that once shared a single sweater shared the same silence again. The same breath of peace, the same understanding that love never leaves, it only changes form. It becomes the air, becomes the rain, it becomes everything that quietly keeps us alive.